Jeb Bush recently made that distinction between those who illegally come to the United States out of what he called an act of love for their families and those who illegally cross U.S. borders or overstay visas.
And they crossed the border because they had no other means to work, to be able to provide for their family. Yes, they broke the law, but it's not a felony. It's kind of it's an act of love. It's an act of commitment to your family.
Although his comments drew a great deal of criticism, they clearly demonstrate a willingness by some in the Republican Party to move forward on an issue they're calling immigration reform. It's an issue that divides parties and, at least for now, has created a political impasse.
We allow more people to come to America legally and stay here legally every year than the rest of the world combined. 1 million people a year. So when we start talking about immigration reform, there are hundreds of issues that need to be addressed, and I want us to address them.
And after Speaker Boehner drew attention to the lack of progress being made in Congress, Senator Mike Lee of Utah responded, quoting now, "I think most members of Speaker Boehner's Republican conference would be willing and eager to pass some form of immigration reform, but it needs to be broken up and it needs to be taken step by step, one step at a time." So, just who are these Republicans spearheading immigration reform? And who is making positive inroads with Hispanic voters? Here to offer her perspective on those questions is columnist and Washington Post blogger Jennifer Rubin. Jennifer, welcome to America's Forum.
It's so nice to be here, JD. Thanks for having me.
Jennifer, as the debate continues, obviously there are many within the establishment, and as we mentioned, Jeb Bush has really staked out a position that at first I thought was almost a variation on George Romney in 1968. But the more I think about it and see it, politically speaking, Jeb has stayed consistent on this issue, and he will have his supporters. The question becomes, is that enough in terms of the party? Will he be able to bring along grassroots Republicans who have real problems with this? And will Speaker Boehner move forward on an immigration reform bill before the midterm elections?
Well, it's interesting. We now think that Jeb Bush is some kind of trailblazer and sort of radical on immigration reform. But if you remember, JD, last year when he came out with his book, all he is willing to do is to go through some legalization. He's not interested in citizenship at all. So I think that may be the basis, if there is one, on moving forward. The Democrats have signaled, frankly, that they're willing to give up a special path to citizenship, in part because they're afraid they're going to lose the Senate, and this may be their last chance to get something done. The question you ask, I think, is a good one, which is it something going to happen in the House? There are a lot of forces in the House other than just Speaker Boehner who are interested in doing something. Paul Ryan has tried to do something in the past. We have some folks who are listening to farm interests, business interests, other constituents in their home districts. And you also have some senators who are pretty conservative who are certainly encouraging the House to move forward. You have Rand Paul, who said the last bill wasn't to his liking, but he's generally in favor of going forth, and he has said flat out the Republican Party needs to move past simply deportation. Jeff Flake is another conservative. So you may have some interest. Whether that's enough to kind of break through, I don't know. And in a way, the disaster of Obamacare, I think, is making it more difficult for the House to pivot to immigration. What I mean by that is that the atmosphere, the territory right now for Republicans is so good that many of them don't want to stop focusing on Obamacare to take up what you rightly call is a very contentious issue.
Right, it would seem that, and the old saying is, when in doubt, leave it out. Since Obamacare unites the party, and that's so important in the midterm, why this insistence? Why does Speaker Boehner say, or he's quoted in the Wall Street Journal as saying he's hell-bent on immigration reform before the election? Doesn't that just engender the kind of splintering that you don't want to see in a party prior to the midterms?
I think it depends on upon what they want to try, there are a few motivations for actually doing something now. One is that the president is threatening to go forth unilaterally. He's done that before, we know. So one thing, for example, that the House could do would be to pass a bill that lays out clearly that their measure and whatever measures they pass have to be enforced in their totality. Secondly, they could go at the enforcement provision, and I think that's what Mike Lee was getting at. There's no reason, for example, why Republicans shouldn't at least pass things that they want: border security, visa overstay, E-Verify. And they're in the driver's seat right now if anything is going to be done. So I think it's entirely possible that Boehner could bring to the floor and pass a very conservative bill which would get support from most people in the caucus. It's not going to be acceptable to the Senate, and it's not going to be acceptable to the president, but it certainly will address the problem that, frankly, Republicans have been raising for a long time, and that is we have not gotten control of our borders. This is an economic issue. This is a national security issue. And there's a certain amount of heat on Republicans for having done nothing in this area. Why don't they at least pass something on the enforcement side of things?
Well, gee, I wish that Speaker Boehner would dust off my old Enforcement First Act of 2006. I tried to persuade then President Bush to get behind that, but George W. Obviously had a different take on immigration. But this is where I think it's fair to say we've seen Republicans get into trouble when they surrender on the enforcement issue. And you may recall that happened to Marco Rubio when he took up with the so-called Gang of Eight in the U.S. Senate, including John McCain and Jeff Flake. The notion from the conservative grassroots wing of the party is you have to have border enforcement. And so you're laying out that possibility. Do you think there's a snowball's chance that Boehner will move something like that, given the position of the U.S. Chamber and other pro-quote reform groups?
Well, I think John Boehner should always listen to J.D. Abrams.
That's
I think
so smart, Jennifer.
Thumb.
Well, we're going to save this. We're going to memorialize that line, Jennifer. I appreciate that. But no, I mean, it's not
Yes.
It's not brain surgery. You find a point of agreement, which is the low-hanging fruit, which is the enforcement component, and then you move forward from there.
I do agree with that. And, you know, Mike Pence was another conservative Republican who came forth with an alternative to the Bush immigration plan, if you remember, back in 2007. So I think we go back a little way. There are some good plans out there that were acceptable to the broad cross-section of Republicans. And I think, truth be told, we do have a cruddy immigration system right now. Employers can't get the very high-tech people. We have visa overstays. We have no really consistent system of verification for employers. So there are lots of things that you'd get 80-90% of the Republicans. And you're correct. Get the things that they agree on now. They can say, we'll come back and get the rest of them, but at least they will have passed something. And they will, I think, diffuse a little bit of the attacks coming their way from the Democrats. And I think they can get on the offensive should the president decide once again to enforce part of a law. This guy apparently thinks he is the chief executive of only the law he likes. That he is only going to enforce parts and bits of the law. He already did this, of course, with his decision on the DREAM Act, which was totally unconstitutional. This is a law passed by Congress, the immigration system that we have, and the president simply decides he's not going to execute and enforce parts of it. That's absurd. So I think it's time for Congress to at least make their views heard uniformly on that part. That's certainly a winner with the base in terms of demanding that the president enforce the law as is. Move forward on the more popular items, and then, as you said way back when, J.D., once you get to enforcement that is satisfactory,
well, Jennifer
then you can have
Rubin,
discussion about other things.
I really appreciate that. We're running out of time here, but we appreciate your perspective there as the columnist of the Washington Post.